Hey all, I think we'll give it a couple more minutes before we start, just to let a few more people join, as I'm still seeing the participant numbers jumping up. It's always that awkward bit at the beginning of a webinar. Thanks for bearing with us. We're all pros at this point, I think. We're all pros at sitting in our Hollywood squares patiently, waiting for the thing to begin. Good. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome. Great, we're just past the top of the hour. So thanks so much for joining us today, everybody. We have some incredible panelists for you. My name is Celia Willett. I am the founder and CEO of an organization called the Responsible Business Initiative for Justice, which does exactly what it sounds like it does. We work with businesses and justice reform community together to build support in for the justice reform process in the US. In particular, we're working on ending extreme sentencing, shrinking the footprint of the justice system across the board, and really digging into support initiatives that increase economic mobility for justice impacted individuals and their families and their communities. Today, we have some incredible policy experts and business leaders who are actually also policy experts for a nuanced conversation about issues that about an issue that actually affects millions of people in the US, and that is pretrial release and cash bail. Millions of legally innocent Americans are held in jail right now, and every year often detained for days, sometimes weeks, often months, simply because of their inability to afford bail. And by contrast, wealthy defendants who perhaps present a danger to the community are able to go free while they await trial simply because they can pay. There's been a lot of conversation across the nation about these practices. They have broad bipartisan support in the Ohio legislature, and there's very much a sense of these reforms are coming up in Ohio, and we want to make sure, all of us on this panel want to make sure that everybody's really equipped with the facts and information that they might need, the questions that they have are answered in order to make a really informed decision about their position on this issue. So today's structure, we are going to have four panelists, five actually. We have one who's just joining, five panelists, and we're going to make sure that we have time for audience questions towards the end. So you're welcome to use the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. You can also use the chat function if you're not locating that Q&A box. Either way, my colleague Silas, who's on this call, will grab your questions. You're welcome to ask them as we go along, and then we'll address them all in the last kind of 15-20 minutes of today's event. I'm actually going to invite the panelists to introduce themselves. So let's start with you, Felicia.
Thank you, Celia. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, everyone. My name is Felicia Williams. I'm the former interim CFO and enterprise risk officer for Macy's. I've been with Macy's for 18 years, and the vast majority of my career with Macy's was in Cincinnati, Ohio. I am currently a fellow with CO Action for Racial Equity, and I'm sure we'll get into that as the conversation goes on.
Amazing. Joe, we'll jump to you next.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joe DeLoss. I am the founder and CEO of a restaurant chain called Hot Chicken Takeover based out of Columbus, Ohio. While we specialize in delicious fried chicken, we are also a fair chance employer that intentionally creates work opportunities for men and women that have been up against adversity in their lives. And that's what brings us here today.
I'm going to add on the back of Joe's comment that last time I was at Joe's restaurant in Columbus, one of his employees showed me that she had the Hot Chicken Takeover logo, which is on Joe's t-shirt, tattooed onto her wrist. And I think that that is a testament to the level of love and respect Joe really fosters in his employees. Michelle, if you wouldn't mind briefly introducing yourself.
Absolutely. Thanks, Celia, for inviting me. I'm Michelle Worovic. I started off life as a budding psychology student, but was recruited to go to law school. So I've been a lawyer. I served on the bench for a municipal court for 7 years. I was policy counsel at the Ohio Supreme Court. And since then, I've been staying in the policy field. I currently head two organizations, NAMSTOL and CILTA Strategy. And we advise governments and businesses and communities on policy, best practices, and also legislation around the globe. So it's great to be here in Ohio, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Michelle. It's so important that you're in this conversation. Ken, very important that you're here too. Tell us a little bit about you.
Thanks, Celia. Good morning, everybody. My name is Ken Oliver. I'm currently the executive director at the Checker Foundation, checker.org, and the vice president of corporate social responsibility for Checker, the corporation. Previously, I was a state policy director for a public interest law firm here in the Bay Area in California, and also a previous executive director for a criminal justice reentry reform organization. So pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Ken. Last but absolutely not least, Micah.
Celia, thank you. And my name is Micah Derry. I am the National Campaign Reform Bail Reform Campaign Director for Arnold Ventures. From right here in Ohio, I'm just outside of Columbus, doing work from right now, literally coast to coast.
Amazing. Let's stick with you, Micah, as we go into our first question. So I confess to being a lawyer too, and love getting kind of the facts on the table as a starting point. So what does it mean when we talk about bail reform, Micah, and who receives bail and who doesn't receive bail currently in Ohio?
No, that's an excellent question. And it's something that the term itself can be confusing for a lot of people who have never actually had to encounter the system. For those that encounter the system, one of the very first things that has to happen when after they're arrested, is a determination that's made. Can they be let go before their trial? Or will they be held before their trial? And sometimes it's not even quite a one or the other decision. It's if they're let go, what are the conditions upon them to be able to go home waiting for the trial? Now, bear in mind, especially in today's day and age and the way the systems become backlogged, we're not talking about hey, make sure you come back next week. Sometimes we're talking about months, or in some extreme cases, even for misdemeanor cases, we can be talking about more than a year. And we've seen that particularly in places down like in Houston, Texas. So we're talking about a period of time for what's the conditions of that individual going home. This is where we talk about cash bail specifically, because often what judges will turn to, and even at the recommendation of the prosecutors, is to put a money holding to be that condition of release for the individual to leave and to be home before their trial while they're still legally innocent. And that ranges drastically. Some states use something called a bond schedule, which means that that monetary amount will be set on the basis of what's the crime they're accused of. Or in other cases, it might be more arbitrary. The problem is that not everyone has the same economic means. And so the result is, while they're still legally innocent and might even be accused of a very minor crime, they might not be able to afford that, because we might be talking about literally thousands upon thousands of dollars that they need to be able to come up with just for the ability to go home. I'll give one very brief example where you can find an example of someone who has a suspended driver's license because they had a lapse in insurance because they couldn't afford it in the first place. This happened recently up in Cuyahoga County, up around Cleveland. And the gentleman ended up being held on a monetary bond for something that was caused by a money issue in the first place. And his children had to find another place to stay because their father was locked up.
I think that impact of pretrial detention is something that's worth kind of framing at the outset here too. Michelle, I would love to bring you in on this. What's your perspective from the bench on how bail is operating in Ohio right now, and what is that impact that you have seen of pretrial detention?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And Micah, you did an excellent job of kind of laying the groundwork. I can share my experiences. When people first appear in front of a judge or a magistrate, they're told that at their initial appearance, they have the right to bail pending disposition of a case. It's interesting, though, I think right now we're reframing that as there's a right to release with appropriate least restrictive conditions. And there was definitely sort of a schedule. So if you looked at all the charges that were pending against that individual, and you look at the maximum fines and penalties, those were all added up. And generally speaking, that was the amount that someone would need to pay in order to have release, unless a prosecutor added some kind of a condition to it. And that's a real issue, because when we look at who is in jail right now, most of the people in jail have not been convicted. They're literally waiting for their case to be heard and resolved by a court. Oftentimes, for various reasons, they waive the right to a speedy trial. So it's called a waiver. It does allow time for things to develop, but it also is going to extend the amount of time that they're being held. And we know that statistically, jails are filled with people disproportionately that are poor, that have substance use disorders, that have mental illness, that are members of racial and ethnic minorities, and they're there waiting for their trials. At this stage in the game, I think one of the important things to remember is that our interests served when we're looking at use of jail are really twofold. One is safety. So if there's a safety issue, someone should not be able to pay $3,000 and get out of jail, right? And we count on our prosecutors to bring those issues to us. Also, we want to make sure they return to court. So those are our two interests. And we know that the data shows that people do return to court. There's a very small percentage of people that seem to be less likely to return to court just because they didn't have to pay money for their release. And in the meantime, we are imposing collateral consequences, to those individuals, as Micah demonstrated. You may lose your home, you may lose your job. You're not there to take care of your children. You're not there to engage in the community. It's incredibly expensive to keep someone in jail. Some of the research also shows that if you have someone in pretrial services reach out to give people reminders to come to jail, kind of like we get to go to the dentist to have our teeth cleaned, right? And it makes sure that if we can't make it, or if we need to make arrangements, it's a good reminder. Sometimes individuals need some assistance in getting to court. It gives time to make those arrangements and to link them to community services. It gives people the right to exercise their due process, to have their cases heard before they're punished. So again, glad to have the question and the conversation.
And I want to just kind of unpack a couple of things that you said. So you made a great point, which you said the purpose of bail, the purpose of pretrial detention is about keeping the community safe and ensuring that somebody comes back for their hearing. From sitting on the bench, from seeing defense lawyers and prosecutors stand in front of you and argue this either way, like they do on every single part of the legal process in America, running from pretrial detention all the way to post-conviction proceedings, do you feel that judges can make those decisions from the bench about how safe somebody is, or how likely they are to come back? How many cases do judges see of this nature? How many times a day are they making that assessment and making that decision?
Judges make those decisions over and over and over again. Some are assigned and all they do are arraignments or initial appearances. When you're in these large municipal courts and smaller counties, you may have certain days of the week or certain, rotations, but these decisions are made all the time. And I think the key is thinking about what information do the judges have when they make the decision, and what process do the judges and magistrates use when they make the decision. And that's where we see a lot of variability. And unfortunately, the variability can lead to the unnecessary incarceration of the individuals that we just talked about.
And I mean, I think if like an outer space alien came to the state of Ohio and was trying to figure this out, they would say, so the judges are making a decision about whether somebody's safe or not. And they do that all the time with a system that's been in place for years and years and years. And the judges are making a decision about whether somebody's a flight risk and won't come back. And they're making that over and over and over again, hundreds or thousands of those decisions in a given year a judge will make. So what's the point in the bail bit? Like if you're assessed at being safe and you're assessed at not being a flight risk, but you can't go home because you can't pay for bail, like what's the point in that third bit? And I think that's what we're kind of all scratching our head on today. Like if a judge can make a decision about whether you're safe or not, and a judge can make a decision about whether you're going to come back or not, why would some people get to the end of that process and say, but even though you've passed these two questions by somebody who's very good at making this decision and has done it many, many times, you still can't go home because your bank account is actually not big enough for you to be able to go home. And I want to bring Joe in at this point, because Joe, this is the kind of thing that affects your business, right? If you have somebody arrested who works for you, they don't show up for work because they're in pretrial detention, you're going to have to let them go, right? You actually have to replace them because you're selling a lot of chicken and you need people working for you. So can you kind of talk us through a little bit, like the work that you're doing on the justice system and why issues like this matter to businesses?
Yeah, thank you for giving us a space on this panel. You know, the reality is we built our company because we were really disenfranchised with how complicated the justice system was. And ultimately realizing that economic mobility, supportive opportunities to advance and grow can be the difference from somebody moving ahead or not. So fast forward now, the landscape for workforce development, the landscape for employers out there is more dire than it's ever been to find qualified, reliable labor to help advance the interest of your business. And many of us know that's because employers haven't always treated people particularly well. But ultimately, we have made a name for ourselves as a best-in-class restaurant chain because of the opportunities we've afforded to a group of people that are hyper focused on their future, not on their past. And so when you think about this complex side on the front end of this system and in this bail reform issue we're talking about, it is really indicative of just one of the many complicated factors that somebody has to navigate to ultimately get themselves back to a place of economic mobility, upward mobility, and advancement. And so our orientation is, how do we build a foundation for people to do that? And if somebody gets that call that they have to appear in court, we're going to be as patient as we can and supportive as we can, because we want that employee back. But time and time again, we have lost employees because complications of the circumstance of the criminal justice system versus that person's character and their willingness and eagerness to get back to work.
And I want to stay with you for a second, Joe, and talk a little bit about your business model, because I've heard you speak about it. And, even from a sort of social justice and morality perspective, like even if you put that aside and you talk about just the dollars and cents, the profit, of the approach that you've taken, can you kind of just speak to that for a second to talk about like what the business case for hiring the communities you hire is?
Yeah, often when we're in settings like this, there's a lot of novelty associated with who we hire, and there's some sympathy and charitable instinct. Hot Chicken Takeover is a very for-profit business that's been able to garner best-in-class investment support and advancement opportunities, and it's because we have a really qualified and highly invested team of people that work on our team, and so we're boasting retention rates that are about 3 times better than our industry. And when you think about this landscape, and a great example is upon recall of our team post-COVID from COVID closures, we recalled 90% of our team within 7 days, when employers, and frankly, it was in the economic best interest of our team to not come back to work and to stay safe at home. And there's just a deep level of commitment and assurance of when you invest in somebody, they will invest in you. And I believe that goes far beyond just this particular target pop that we're talking about. But it's made a dramatic difference in our business, and it's allowed us to advance in a really meaningful way to scale our impact.
I think that's so important to talk about that retention, the return rate after COVID, and double underline that you work in the food service industry, which is a sector that was pretty much the worst. Hospitality and food service sector was the one that was the worst hit by returning from COVID. Felicia, I'd love to bring you in here. I see you nodding away, and tell us a little bit about why CEO Action is supporting bail reform in particular. Oh, you're on mute. There we go.
Thank you, Celia. And I just first want to say, Joe, retailers would love to have that type of retention rate. That is absolutely amazing. So kudos to you guys. So CEO Action for Racial Equity is a business coalition of over 100 companies from across America, ranging from retailers to manufacturers, accountants, suppliers, et cetera. We are mobilizing business leaders with diverse expertise to advance public policy. One of our key priorities is decriminalizing poverty. And simply, this means confronting the aspects of our justice system that hurt low-income and working-class communities, not because they have committed a crime, but because they lack the means to afford cash bail or judicial costs. We believe that a person's inability to pay fines, fees, or cash bail should never be the sole reason for incarceration, and that our justice system should not disproportionately punish those experiencing poverty. You know, from a business standpoint, one of the major obstacles that we've all been talking about is that employers are experiencing labor shortages across the country and definitely in Ohio. With 1 in 3 adults having an arrest record, I'll say that again, with 1 in 3 adults having an arrest record, a significant number of people get caught up in the justice system. Many companies, as Joe shared, are already taking steps to expand their workforce, such as training and reskilling and upskilling, apprenticeship programs that include fair chance hiring, advocating for the Ohio Fresh Start Act that allowed more returning citizens to get occupational licenses, and so much more. But I would argue there is a step before fair chance hiring and fresh start, and that's pretrial fairness. If someone gets arrested, as we've been talking about, for a non-serious charge and detained pre-trial because they cannot afford bail, they will not be showing up for work. No calls, no shows are problematic, especially when employers are already dealing with staffing issues. Losing a trained worker or a team member can have long-lasting implications on everything from the cost to recruit and train, poor customer service, to inefficient manufacturing or delayed delivery operations, et cetera. You know, Celia, ultimately, I would say these policies should matter to businesses because it is disruptive to our operations when our employees cannot come to work. It is burdensome on other employees who have to pick up the slack or pick up extra shifts. And quite honestly, it's disrespectful to taxpayers who have to pay the bill to jail someone who is not a risk to the community.
Yeah, and you know, you said it at the beginning of those remarks, you know, that CEO action does not support systems, you know, supports ending systems where somebody's ability or inability to pay is the reason why they do or don't stay in jail. And I think, you know, even saying that out loud, it seems like an absolute no-brainer that none of us would support systems that make the decision, you know, exactly as we started with Michelle. Safety is the judge's decision, return is the judge's decision. Money should not be part of this, right? That actually has no relevance to safety or flight risk. Ken, I really want to bring you in here, definitely continuing the theme of business leaders that are also policy experts. You know, Felicia touched on the harm to communities of pretrial detention, and I saw you nodding away, and I want to bring you in on that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that, Celia, and thank you for having me here today. I just want to double click a little bit, going back to what Michelle said, and then also what Joe and Felicia said about the way we look at harm and public safety. It's very important that we look at that as a two-way lens, because when it comes to Black and brown people, specifically Black communities, there's an argument to be made about whether we're experiencing safety in our own communities, because all of the data shows that we suffer from over arrest. African Americans are incarcerated 3.5 times more than other populations. So there's a very big disproportionate piece there. And so when we talk about some of the terror and trauma that's brought to our communities from police departments, et cetera, I think it's important that we look at that from both ways, because we also want to be safe in our communities, right? In reference to the devastation and the harm that occurs, I mean, it's already been said, and said a lot eloquently, more eloquently than I can say it, about what happens when a person loses their job because they're suffering from pretrial detention, and how difficult it is for that family or for that support to continue on for people's families. And that trickles down into the communities, right? And so communities ultimately are harmed when dollars and workers and housing, the ability to be housed safely, is all affected from a pretrial detention, right? I often tell people every day that, you know, mass incarceration isn't good for business, because you lose touch with the community, you lose touch with workers, you lose touch with a potential customer. And so it behooves business to invest into the communities and take a stance on some of these more important social issues, and not just simply rely on government, because it's not only is it the right thing to do, it's also important to the bottom line. And so, you know, looking at it from both sides of the equation, and understand it's not just about people who are arrested committing acts of crime or terror to other community members, I think it's a deeper issue than that. It's been spoken about today, but those are some of the things that I would add in reference to the harm that it does to communities, specifically Black and Brown communities, in a disproportionate way.
Thank you so much, Can, for underlining that. And I think, it's interesting that there are kind of two top line reasons why businesses are looking at this, and they're not antithetical to one another. And one is social and one is financial, one is economic, right? And I think we're now clearly at this place where these two things are not mutually exclusive. You don't have to be a feelsy kind of business or a numbersy type of business. I think you can be absolutely both. You can be a level-headed practical business that says we need workers, and you can also be one that says we have commitments to social justice, DE&I, and community investment. And unless we adjust the justice system as a component of that, we're probably not really scratching much more than the very, very, very surface of this. Felicia, I wanted to kind of come to you and talk a little bit about brand. I think whenever I talk to business leaders, and we've talked to hundreds over the years, they get it, and they'll often, I'll often get that kind of like, I'm with you, but my fear is, my risk and my fear is brand, that we'll actually get in trouble for speaking out about these kind of issues. Talk to us about how you thought that through, and how you respond to that.
Yes, for sure. And, as a former CFO and enterprise risk officer, I completely understand how justice system issues can be third rail type topics and thus can be perceived as brand risky. In our conversations with business leaders, you can almost hear the sphincters clenching, right? As we discuss pretrial equity and bail reform.
Or loosening sometimes.
Yeah, loosening, but we are not talking about letting everyone out of jail, nor are we talking about locking everyone up or changing what is legal or removing effective consequences. Having means does not equate to innocence, and living below the poverty line does not equate to guilt. Pretrial equity, we try to get people to understand, is more than just a criminal justice issue. It really is an economic issue that impacts Ohioans and the business community. Data shows that spending time in jail before trial makes working class Ohioans less likely to participate in the labor market even years later. That means fewer workers for us to hire and less state revenue for core duties in the future. Celia, contrary to some of the misleading and fear-mongering scare tactics that is occurring, make bail changes. This piece of legislation, it is a common sense, bipartisan piece of legislation that will have an immediate impact in Ohio. It will promote liberty, protect employment, keep families safe, uphold Americans' right to due process and equal protection under the law. It will contribute to the state's ability to build a more sustainable workforce, which is hugely important given our current labor shortage issues. And ultimately, it will help close equity gaps that have historically limited full participation in the labor market. And so I believe that when we speak to business leaders, we really explain what this piece of legislation does. We explain, the level of support and how it really impacts their businesses and their operations. I think that gives them sufficient cover to respond and to sort of dial down some of the misperception that tends to happen when we when we talk on cash bail reform.
Yeah. And, I think some of that risk about brand that people see is often a fear of wading into politics. And, and there's a couple of things on that. Number one, businesses are kind of being expected to wade into politics. Like we're in this, we're in 2022, and that's a fact. And then I think the second part is we're here on a panel talking about Ohio, guys. Like this is not got one color or another attached to it. Like, we're talking about a real chance to change the bail system in Ohio. That is we're not talking about a woke state or a democratic, a dem colored state. So Joe, I want to bring you in and get you to kind of think about, like, what do Ohioan business leaders need to know about this issue?
When I think about bail reform as part of a series of interventions that we're talking about in a very complex system, the reality is, what better place to start? This is an opportunity we have right now. It is bipartisan. You have a tremendous amount of support coming from both sides of the aisle. And so it's a really meaningful step forward. Is it the only thing we do? Absolutely not. You know, this same panel of people are advocating for so many types of changes, but it's a real opportunity now. And as we look at what's happening in our state, I mean, we just had an announcement of one of the biggest infusions of economic development and capital to happen in Ohio that's going to necessitate tremendous amounts of employees to build the Intel facility, to staff it, to do all these things. And so, and I know from being out here that it's not particularly easy right now on the ground to find the teams you need. And so if we're actively making choices to limit our access to anybody that could be an eligible contributor to our workforce, we're absolutely shooting ourselves in the foot. And so what better place to start than bail reform and the issue that's right in front of us that's getting a lot of support. And so that's why we jumped on the opportunity to advocate for it. And we'll do the same for anything else that comes along as well, I know.
I think that's a really good point, though. You know, like, why are we here talking to businesses about bail reform? And the answer is because actually this is the time for businesses to be involved in bail reform. Organizers and advocates like Micah have spent a long time putting the work in. They've got this bill to a point that it's like at a tipping point, it really could be implemented. The foot needs to go hard on the gas at this point. And therefore, you know, it's a good time for businesses to weigh in. They're that amazing tipping point, closing picture voice that have like considerable leverage. And I think that that's a good kind of layup for Micah. Micah, can you kind of talk us through what's on the table in Ohio, you know, where we are with the campaign to change the bail system in Ohio, you know, what's being considered right now?
Absolutely. So it's probably easiest to start by talking about what the Ohio legislation is not. It's not New York bail reform. It's not Chicago bail reform. For so many of the politicians in the Ohio legislature, when it comes to the criminal justice system, they're at best lay people, and they get information the same way you and I do. And that is through social media, through a digest that pops into their email inbox. And so much of the news that is out there about the words bail reform today are unfortunately coming from a very broken system in New York that, let's face it, is impacted by far more than their bail process. The Ohio system, there's a couple of key things to know. One, it does not eliminate cash bail altogether. Instead, it opens up the menu for judges to make decisions, to look at what specifically at, is this person a public safety risk? If they are, then detain them. Don't put a condition on it. This has real world implications. Just before the new year, there was a young man right here in Columbus, right next to where I live, who was witnessed to shoot and kill a young woman. He was arrested. He was put on $100,000 bail. He somehow made that $100,000 bail, and he turned around and less than 2 weeks later had shot and killed a 21-year-old man. We want to be able to have judges look very specifically at the safety aspect and then turn from there and say, what does it take to have this person return? Statistics show that cash has very little play whatsoever in making sure someone does show up. So instead of looking at, you know, perhaps it is electronic monitoring, or maybe even something even less invasive. Maybe it's having to check in with the court every week. And to the point that was made earlier, I loved it. Sometimes just getting that text reminder, the same way we do about it's time to go back to the dentist, sometimes that has been shown even in cities like Toledo, that has a profound impact in having people show up. The second thing to know about what this is that it is not in any way undermining what is legal and what's not. I think it was Felicia that pointed to this and saying that it does not change if someone is guilty. And once they've had their Sixth Amendment right fulfilled, they've gotten that day in court, if it is determined they're guilty, they will still face full punishment. This doesn't undermine that whatsoever. It only looks at that first phase. Where we stand today, there's companion bills in the House and Senate. The companion bill just means they're identical. They're the exact same. Between the two chambers, with well over 50 co-sponsors, legislators on both sides of the aisle that are willing to say, put my name on this bill from the beginning. Now, we have been meeting for a year now with stakeholders, people who are from all facets that are impacted by this bill. And we recognize there's some things that need to be improved in it. And that's why the bill sponsors in the Senate are going to be bringing forward a sub bill very soon to address some of those concerns that were brought out from the processes by the judges, some of the concerns that were brought out by prosecutors that we recognize this could be improved upon. When that bill is actually, that sub bill is brought forward, that we expect very soon that the Senate committee will vote on it. It will go to the Senate floor. And then sometime between now and the end of the year is when the House will actually move the bill. Support is vital, though. And if you'll allow me, one thing I'm going to address the elephant in the room, guys. It's an election year. And because it's election year, politicians who have their name on the ballot and they're expecting you and everyone else in their community to punch next to their name, they get very, very nervous about things. That's why it makes support more important than ever, especially from business leaders, to be able to help affirm that, listen, people do care about this. It might not be at the top of the red meat for your party. It might not be right there at the top of the list of what everyone talks about, but this impacts us. This impacts your community and it impacts our values. It impacts our businesses, makes that support more important than ever so that we can get these bills across the finish line.
That's amazing, Micah. I'm gonna encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A box because we're gonna begin taking questions in just one moment. But I wanted to bring Michelle in too on what this bill that is in Ohio would and wouldn't do. Is there anything to add that you would like to add about, like from the bench, what if this were to come into law in the state of Ohio, how would that change the role and responsibilities of the judge?
Excellent question. I think first and foremost, it gives clarity and consistency across the whole state. You shouldn't have a pretrial process that is up to a random selection within your county or the county where you end up being charged. So we need to make sure that these rights are protected equally across the whole state. And I wanted to piggyback on a couple of, I think, really important things that have been said before. Felicia talked about risk. And communities get very worried about risk. I know, Micah, you addressed it also. I want to point out that there's a risk to the community if people are held in jail. And so their data show that even 3 days in jail can substantially increase the recidivism rate even 2 years after the final disposition of that case. And it also makes it more likely that additional crimes would be committed while that first case is still pending. So there's this fallacy that somehow having people in jail somehow makes the community safer. And I think communities and businesses need to understand that in the short term, when someone's removed from the community, there's this perception that we are promoting safety, but actually we're setting ourselves up for longer term issues. And those have already been mentioned. One other thing too, that I was really excited to see in the legislation is that cash bail is an issue, but the conditions of release in addition to cash also can be an issue. And so, Joe, when you were talking about people coming to work, it reminded me of a lot of courts that I've been in. And I've seen judges that want people to report to the court every day at noon to check in with a pretrial or a probation officer. Or they want to have, drug screens at 10 o'clock in the morning. So there's no regard for how someone can manage their family and their business obligations. Businesses have been more than patient when they can be, but quite frankly, if it's a lunch rush and you have one of your key employees needing to go to report to court so that they're not held in contempt, that really gets in the way. And that leads to net widening. And so what is net widening? It means that there are charges filed against the individual to begin with, but if they're not able to keep up with the terms and conditions of the release, now they have more challenges. They can be held in contempt of court, they can be arrested, and actually the problem could have grown. So I just want to thank you for also touching those issues that I think really have a business consequence as well.
That's really, sorry. Yeah, Felicia, I was actually going to bring you in.
I was going to say one thing really quickly, because we've talked about a lot of the consequences. The one we haven't, and maybe Michelle or Micah can talk to this one as well, that when you're held pretrial, you are more likely to take a plea deal, whether you're guilty or innocent. And I think, I know I probably couldn't survive an hour, held pretrial. And so the idea that you're held for 3, 4, as Micah said, up to a year, and you take a plea deal just because you want to get out of jail, not really appreciating the downstream consequences now of having a record. And so, yes, there is business impact, there's economic impact, there's individual housing, children, as we've discussed, but there's also that pressure on people to take a deal regardless of their guilt or innocence.
And I spent a decade as a defense lawyer before doing this, and I would underline that by saying that the folk that's suffering from mental illness, you increase the likelihood that they're going to take a plea deal at any cost, because jail is incredibly chaotic, very stressful. There's no sense of routine. People are coming and going. It's terrifying, honestly. Sometimes it's a little scary visiting as a defense lawyer, and I cannot imagine sleeping in dorms inside a jail. And so those that are suffering, perhaps coming off addiction withdrawal, or suffering from mental health, those were my clients where I would come and visit, and they'd be like, I don't care what it is, I'm signing it. I have to get out of here. And Michelle, you mentioned earlier that people waive speedy trial, and if somebody's listening to this thinking, well, they've agreed to stay in county jail, that's on them. They could have had a speedy trial, but they've agreed to it. Again, as you said that, I was thinking, have I ever in my career not advised a client to waive speedy trial? And I can't think of a single example where I've ever said to a client, even that it was an option, right? Coming and being like, you absolutely have to waive speedy trial because we need time to do this well. It's really every single defense lawyer will be coming to their client and advising them to the maximum of their ability to waive speedy trial. So it's not realistically an option that is honestly on the table for most defendants, because most defense lawyers, especially in serious cases, are going to come in and really, really, really advise their client to waive speedy trial. So it's certainly not a real choice, to be honest, for people to leave if they want to under a speedy trial. We have defense lawyers who have caseloads that are in the hundreds of cases, and in order to adequately prepare somebody for their opportunity to be in trial, they need more time than a speedy trial will allow. So it's kind of important to talk about that likelihood of sitting in county jail and making pretty rash decisions in order to get out. I think that's a really good point. I see Micah nodding away on this, and I want to bring him in as some of the questions are coming in on what these kind of consequences are.
You just nailed it absolutely on the plea bargaining aspect. And when you think about someone who is in, let's face it, the worst situation of their lives, their freedom has been taken away. And even if they are someone who is guilty, and let's make that assumption for one moment, they are guilty of whatever it is that they're charged of. They're finding that didn't happen in a vacuum. There were things that led to that. There were things that it's complicated. And I'm not taking away from their guilt, but the point being that this did not happen in a vacuum. And now they are truly in a position where they don't have access to their phone. They don't have access to people who can help them construct their defense. So any mitigating factors that might have been there that a judge deserves to know about, being able to bring in those witnesses even is very challenging. And let's not even get started on the public defense aspect, where you have a complete caseload that is beyond sustainable, yet we keep on doing it. So the bottom line, you have a defendant who is in a bad situation. And when they're given the option, you know what? I know this really sucks for you. We can make this go away. We just need you to plead to this lesser charge. Don't worry, this one's not a felony. This one's just a misdemeanor. You'll get minimal time. You can be home in 3 months. Shoot, in some cases, you can go home next week, especially for someone who has children or has found out that their employer is saying, listen, if we don't get you back soon, we're going to have to give your job away. Or let's not forget this one. Rent is due next week. If you are not able to fulfill those, all of a sudden, man, having a misdemeanor on my record doesn't sound that bad. That's the kind of pressure and the leverage that we face. And so then now we get to, okay, that decision's been made. The one that was made immediate and in the moment, someone who's trying to get out of a bad situation where their freedom's been taken away. Okay, they've accepted the misdemeanor now, which maybe they are not even guilty of in the first place. Again, we'll assume that they are. They have that misdemeanor now on their record. Okay, they're back home. They've missed however long of work. They are now further behind on their bills. They are now potentially having difficulty with gaining employment. What is the likelihood then that they're going to make more bad decisions, bearing in mind that their record of bad decision-making has led them into this place in the first place? We go back to that cost to society. We need to protect the presumption of innocence. We need to protect public safety. And if we fail to be able to reconcile the two, we end up with more violence in our streets in the first place. And we consequently have a very ineffective and expensive system that only puts people in a spiral of bad decision-making that will cost society as a whole more in the long run.
I see you nodding away, Ken, so I want to bring you in here.
Yeah, I just want to double click on what Micah said about some of the pressures that pretrial defendants face when taking plea bargains. It doesn't just extend to misdemeanors, it also extends to felonies and the amount of time that people think that they can serve, not understanding some of those collateral consequences that Michelle spoke about earlier. I mean, there are 48,000 different laws in the books for people who have committed a felony that prevent them from either getting employment or access to housing or some other type of social service. And so there's still this notion of civil death, even though we've moved on from King's England 1,000 years ago. We still have sentenced people to these second life sentences after they've done incarceration. So it's important to also talk about that when we're talking about what happens with bail. And I think there's another thing about cost that really hasn't been addressed, and I'll address what's happening just in California briefly. Like in California, if somebody steals something, let's say for $1,500, we actually spend $120,000 to incarcerate that person in a prison sentence that could last 2-3 years. So it ends up being a cost of $500,000 that society pays or the community pays for $1,500 in property theft, right? And so, if we were on Wall Street or in Silicon Valley, I mean, we'd be bankrupt in a month if we went with that business model, right? And so there are a lot of other alternatives that we can do, especially when we talk about property crimes, especially when we talk about non-violent crimes or crimes that may be victimless in the traditional sense, where we could put people in programs, immediately release them, put them in restitution type programs, do things that really think about restoration to the community and society rather than this punishment model. And out in California, we've been really pushing an investment in people over punishment, because you actually get a better result when you take that same money and you invest in people and say, okay, what are the things, because Micah alluded to this earlier, what are the things that led to this, because it didn't exist in a vacuum? And then how can we reconcile what got you to this place to begin with? And that's actually a cheaper and more human-centered way to deal with somebody, especially if it's not, a capital crime or something, extremely heinous, to deal with that individual and also give the community an opportunity to heal over the long term. Because if you keep sending people to prison and there's these collateral consequences, people don't always have access to resetting and rebuilding their lives. So we just exacerbate the problem, and then that, it goes back, it's cyclical, right? So yeah, I would just add that part and think about the way that we're investing our dollars and the cost to communities and to businesses specifically when we invest that type of money from our tax base.
Yeah, I think let's stay with this topic of cost for a little bit. Across the board, I think, we work with a lot of international and multinational businesses. And I do think that America's expenditure on incarceration is something that company leaders from other countries just cannot understand. When we're spending something in the region of $30,000 per inmate, more than per child in the public school system, from an investment perspective, a business will want an educated workforce rather than an incarcerated workforce, right? This is a sort of lose-lose scenario. But staying on bail reform in Ohio, Micah, we have a good question come in, which is it actually cheaper if we reform this system and more people are out pre-trial? Is that something that you've got research on, or you can kind of share information with right now?
Absolutely. There was work that was done right around the beginning of the pandemic. And so the reason that matters is it was drawing on data from before the pandemic, and to some extent, the normal that we want to get back to, right? And part of what it found is that the cost of the, again, I want to be careful saying violent versus non-violent, but when we're talking about non-violent defendants alone, if we were to take them out of the pretrial system in Ohio, that alone could save the state upwards of $160 million a year on that alone. And that's where I'm addressing some of the nuances. Now, before people get excited, and again, it's an election year, so we got to be careful what people hear when they hear that. We're not saying that's a $160 million tax cut that we can give. As John was pointing, as Ken was pointing to just a moment ago, the other services that would be better long-term need to be invested in. We have some great stuff here in Ohio. And frankly, a lot of it has come out of the business community in Ohio. And it's been business leaders that have instituted programs that were able to be replicated. And we have examples of that all over the state. Many of the best programming has come out of the business sector and has been melded into some of the state's processes. we need to better invest in some of those places, because this is really just a partial fix to what is really a much larger system that needs to be repaired. Ultimately, it is a net savings, because what we're doing right now is not sustainable. And if you just for one moment play the game of trickling across the impact, the ripple effect of taking one person out of the workforce, out of the home, out of a family, the impact is phenomenal. And especially then, as was already pointed about the collateral sanctions, then you bring that person back, because the fact is the vast majority of people who are in jail today will be returned to society. And when we make it harder for them when they come back, that ripple effect just gets hit with another rock in the water, and then it's all across each other. And the extent is ultimately expensive to the taxpayer. To be able to repurpose $100 million, $200 million and more in Ohio is really an investment in our future to help solve a problem that's been compounding since the 70s.
And I don't think it's a new idea that states are looking at their justice system as a way to address workforce issues, and I think, and I also don't think this is a political issue. I think about states that are taking on bail reform, clean slate, professional licensing reform, and it's all designed to try to remove those barriers. Ken, perhaps you can talk to us a little bit about California firefighters, which I think is such a good example of like how ridiculous some of these barriers are. A state like Utah has just turned on clean slate legislation, which is automating criminal records. And on the day they did, 400,000 people's records got expunged. Why is Utah doing this? Lots of different reasons, but one of them is they want 400,000 people really applying for jobs in the workplace. Why? Because Utah wants businesses to invest, and they're able to demonstrate to companies that they will be able to put job ads out for, positions, recruit for positions available and have applicants rather than kind of draw a blank. Ken, can you kind of briefly talk about those some of those crazy collateral consequences that we see when we wrap people up unnecessarily in the justice system? Like how big are these barriers?
The barriers are, I hate to say it, they're asinine in many ways. They just don't make any sense. And so, for example, in California, we have a huge fire issue. And every year, thousands of people who are incarcerated go out and help fight fires in California, and actually are major participants in saving lives and preventing property damage. Yet when people are released from incarceration, whether it's pre-trial or post-trial, they're not allowed to become firefighters legitimately. So that's like one of the collateral consequences that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because when it's convenient for the state to use this labor pool, they do. And then when a person actually tries to do the right thing and says, hey, I think I can do a career with this, and then actually try to get on that pathway, they short stop them. The same thing is ironically true for something as simplicity as being able to be a barber in California, where it's mandated in the county jail system and in the prison system that people who are incarcerated have to cut hair. In fact, there's tests that you have to take to get qualified to test hair, and it's mandatory. You'll be punished incarcerated if you don't take that particular job. But then when you come home, if you've been incarcerated, whether it's a year or 10 years, and you've learned to become a barber, and you say, hey, I think I can do this for a career and build a livelihood for myself, you can't get licensed as a cosmetologist, right? And as I mentioned earlier, there's 48,000 different variants of these different types of things. I recently had a call, and I won't put the name out there, but a very, very huge online real estate company who wanted to employ people who had been incarcerated. And they were like, Ken, we love fair chance. We love to be able to give justice impacted people an opportunity, but we can't get them licensed to be able to talk about real estate on the telephone. We can give them call center jobs at, $10 an hour, which, is not exactly ideal for people who are trying to rebuild their lives. But when it came time for that economic mobility piece, like there's licensing restrictions, right? And that's across sectors. Same with EMT. People who are forced to be EMTs in prison can't be EMTs when they come out into the community. So, there's a big effort now, and you and I have talked about, Celia, what's going on across this country with Clean Slate. It's something that, we've talked about across this country. And I think that as more of these conversations happen around bail and the consequences that occur for people, I think we'll continue to get some more traction. We still got a lot of work to do, but we can't incarcerate people and then say afterwards, when we let them out, to Micah's point, everyone's coming back home. And in most cases, we're going to prevent you from actually rebuilding. And then if we're going to do that, what are we expecting for folks to do? Like, if we're not going to give them jobs, we're not going to get them into housing. Where is it that we want to set these folks at if we take that stance as a society? And it's very harmful when we do.
I think what you're saying and what Michelle said earlier is so clear. When we think about these harm reduction policies that actually businesses and legislators are getting on board with left and right, we should be thinking about the beginning of this process, right? You are so much more likely to need that help later if you end up in the justice system, right? So we should be focusing equal or more attention on preventing justice system engagement, justice system, to the extent, absolutely maximum extent possible. We should be preventing people from ending up in a position where we're having to try to mitigate the harm of the justice system. If we can prevent that at the source, we should be doing that, which is why I think that bail reform sits with these workforce and recovery kind of repair policy legislations like clean slate, like professional licensing reform. I saw a finger go up and I want to
I just wanted to double click because it's something I'm so passionate about. And Felicia actually clicked on it earlier, and I just want to double click at this moment about what the number one driver of incarceration is, whether it's pre-incarceration and post-incarceration. And it's not good people, bad people, right? It's poverty. Outgrowths of poverty. That is the number one driver of incarceration. So when we think about that, the question should be, how do we end poverty? How do we get people to livable wage work? How do we get people to sustainable, safe housing? And if we can address some of those more systemic issues, then some of these other collateral issues that we're talking about, the massive bail reforms and the sentencing, all those things will start to slowly melt away. But it's important when we have these conversations that we always let people know that it's poverty and people's desire to reach to get the things that we all take for granted every day: safe housing, safe, healthy food, things for our families, middle-class economy access. Those are the things that most people want. And if we address those things, a lot of these other things will, as I mentioned, start to go away.
Well, we have this real opportunity in Ohio to look at the system at the source, right? To address the system at the start of somebody's interaction with the justice system and change that, to change the course for people that are touching the justice system at the beginning. So let's close out today. I'm going to kind of do a little whip around. We have a great question, like, what can businesses do? What can businesses do and how can we get them involved? Joe, you've worked with us on so many Ohio campaigns. You are the face of Ohio business community. Maybe we can start with you and then we'll turn to Felicia. What can businesses do?
Yeah, I mean, the time is now. I think Cornell's report from their hospitality school said it cost about $5,000 to turn over an entry-level employee in our segment. And so this is, now more than ever, we need to speak up and think about the sustainability of our workforce and the economic mobility of the people that we're hiring. And so the RBIJ is really who's empowered me to feel like I have a voice in the space in a meaningful way. And I have been so surprised by the power of picking up the phone and talking to folks in the legislative system across the spectrum, just to acknowledge what's facing our business and what we can do about it. And those calls go a really long way to help people understand what is actually facing our community and our businesses. And so we just have to pick up the phone, I think is the lowest barrier way to get started. And for better or for worse, those of us as business leaders probably carry too much power and too much accessibility to these political leaders. And so we might as well use it for something that can advance our community and alongside that, advance our businesses in a meaningful way.
I know for a fact, because I was there when it happened, that Joe's phone call on one particular issue in the Ohio legislature had almost horrifyingly large impact and really swung the day on a very, very, very important issue that had been very hard to pass for many previous years. So Felicia, I see you nodding. Let's close it out with you. And I'm going to say to my amazing colleague Silas before everybody leaves to put his email address into the chat box so that businesses listening can take that next step and get in touch with RBIJ. But Felicia, let's give you the last word. Close us out.
I cannot agree more with what Joe shared. Pretrial changes have never been more important for businesses than they are right now when we are struggling with staffing shortages. You know, big picture, as business leaders, we have a responsibility to our employees and our customers to help make sure they, you know, as Ken said, they live and work in safe, financially stable and healthy neighborhoods. That is why we are doing businesses in the communities where we are doing businesses. So yes, call your legislators. I know some of you guys may have other legislative priorities, but when we take a look at where we are now in Ohio and the need to, you know, stabilize the workforce, expand the workforce, build a labor pool, being able to articulate why bail reform is so important and how that directly links to your workforce challenges. Legislators want to hear that. They want to understand that. As we've discussed, this is not a space where businesses feel comfortable traditionally playing or traditionally weighing in. But hopefully you've learned enough today where you feel empowered to speak on this subject. And if not, contact Silas. He can put you in. We have some one-pagers, we have some talking points, we have bill summaries. We can help you make the case to legislators.
Felicia, Michelle, Ken, Micah, and Joe, thank you, my friends. It has been so great being on this panel with you today. I'm grateful for your time and your passion and your energy on this. And thank you so much to everybody who's attended. Yeah, that's us.